Sometimes the Magic community will see a card get spoiled and assume it's going to be really strong. People will rush to buy tons of copies or start trying to build tons of decks around the mechanic, but then once the card comes out, it doesn't go anywhere or win anything. Today, we're going to go over cards that the Magic community completely misevaluated. Starting us off at number 10, we have Asmoranomardicadaistinaculdacar. This is a 3/3 red-black legendary human wizard with no mana cost. It has the ability where, if you've discarded a card this turn, you can cast it for 1 hybrid black-red mana. Whenever she enters the battlefield, you search your library for a card named the Underworld Cookbook, reveal it, and put it into your hand. She also has the ability where you can sacrifice 2 foods to have target creature deal 6 damage to itself. For anyone who doesn't know, the Underworld Cookbook is an artifact with a mana cost of 1. You can tap it and discard a card to make a food token, and you can pay 4, tap, and sacrifice it to return target creature from your graveyard to your hand. On release, people were speculating this card could generate a new archetype in Modern. There were tons of cards with discard synergies that had seen play before, such as Hollow One and Flameblade Adept. Cards like Ovalchase Daredevil could be discarded to Cookbook and then return itself to your hand, letting you get free food. And then there were great enablers with discarding cards like Street Wraith, who could let you get an Asmo out on turn 1 without losing any card advantage. On top of all of this, a 1-mana 3/3 seemed like a great deal. So lots of people thought that Asmo food would be one of the better archetypes to come out in Modern Horizons 2. The deck saw heavy play for the first couple of weeks of the new format, but then quickly dried up. Nowadays, it's more of a niche brew than a meta-relevant contender. What went wrong with such a promising deck? Well, it turned out that there were just more straightforward and powerful things to be doing. Cards like Dragon's Rage Channeler were better straightforward beaters, and the ability to kill your opponent's cards was really overshadowed by cards like Fury and Solitude. Not to mention that 6 damage would often miss out on killing incredibly important threats in the metagame, like Murktide Regent and Death's Shadow. All of this combined with the fact that the card could be rather clunky in certain scenarios caused Asmo to quickly fall by the wayside. Now, the reason this card is only at number 10 is that it wasn't that highly rated. People thought the deck would be real, but not that many people thought the deck would break the game or anything. The card did end up dropping a lot in price after release, but it was never that high to begin with, showing that there was interest in the card, but the expectations weren't quite as high as with a lot of the other cards on this list. And at number 9, we have Alchemist Gambit. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 and 2 red, but it has a cleave cost of 4, 2 blue, and 1 red. Cleave is a mechanic where, if you cast a card for its cleave cost, you remove all the text in the card in the brackets. So, if you played this card for 3 mana, you would take an extra turn, but then you would lose the game at the end of that turn. However, the cleave cost removed that downside, meaning you get to simply take an extra turn with no questions asked, though you did always have to exile the card afterwards. When this card was spoiled, a lot of players thought the card was way too good and would break the game. However, a lot more experienced players and pro players took one look at the card and said it wouldn't see play at all. Why was there this disconnect between groups of players? Well, you have to understand the context of the standard format at the time. You see, the best deck in the format at the time was Blue-Red Control, which ran the card Alrund's Epiphany. This was a 7-mana sorcery that allowed you to take an extra turn and create 2 1/1 blue bird creature tokens, and then exile itself. This card was incredibly good and has been seen play ever since it was released. However, after Standard rotated in September, the format lost a lot of cards and got much weaker, as is normal for Standard rotations. It was at that point that Blue-Red Control became the best deck in Standard, and Epiphany was terrorizing the arena ladders. People hated this deck and hated having to wait for their opponent to take a turn after turn while they sat there doing nothing. Combine this with the fact that another extra turn spell, specifically Nexus of Fate, had just been the best deck a couple of formats ago, and people were really upset about the idea of an extra turn spells in general at this point. However, veterans to the game knew that these cards were actually usually a lot weaker than they seemed. You see, extra turn spells often don't actually accomplish much, as usually you need to spend all your mana on the turn to cast them. This means that they usually just cycle for a new card and don't do much of anything. In order for them to be good, you need to have cards in play. In the case of these two problematic extra turn spells, the issue was that Alrund's made you creatures, meaning it got around this downside on its own, and Nexus shuffled itself into your deck, unlike both Epiphany and Gambit, which exiled themselves, letting people come with strategies where they recycle the Nexus to take infinite turns. Gambit did none of these things, and the modality on the card wasn't really worth it. As a result, the card didn't even see play until Epiphany got banned, and it became the new best option. This card's success has been extremely limited, and all in all, it's safe to say that a lot of people overreacted to the card when it was first spoiled. And at number 8, we have Doom Whisperer. This is a 6/6 Nightmare Demon with a mana cost of 3 and 2 black. It has Flying, meaning it can't be blocked by creatures without flying, and Trample, meaning it can deal excess combat damage to defending player or planeswalker when attacking. It has the ability where you can pay 2 life to Surveil 2, meaning you can look at the top 2 cards of your library and then put them either back on top or into your graveyard however you like. When this card came out, a lot of people thought the card would be incredibly strong. The stat line was incredibly impressive, and the activated abilities seemed great. A big concern with these kinds of cards in Standard is making sure you get some value out of them quickly as to make sure you don't get blown out by cheap removal spells. And Whisperer could do a lot to help you set up your next draw. However, when the card actually released, it saw a lot less play than people thought. It was still used in some decks as a curve topper, but the price of the card quickly crashed and it didn't take the world by storm the way a lot of players thought it would. So, why did people misevaluate the card? The issue is that the activated ability was much worse than people thought. It was easy to compare the ability to something like Yawgmoth's Bargain, a famously powerful magic card. These types of abilities that you can pay life to activate as much as you want are traditionally very strong. On top of that, people often say that Scrying 2, or Surveilling in this case, is about equivalent in value to drawing a card. Sure, it doesn't draw you a card at the end of the day, so it's a lot weaker, but it does get you a lot of value. However, making a lot of life to surveil was never really a good idea. You would do it once or twice to make sure you drew a good card, but beyond that, you were just losing life for no reason. Standard doesn't have many specific cards that are game-changing over other cards, like in older formats. There's no cards like Ensnaring Bridge to lock your opponent out, or crazy combos to pull off, so you would often just be looking for any draw spell or any kill spell to draw into. This meant that activating it over and over to dig for a certain card was often really bad, so the value you got off the card was usually very limited. This made it fall into the trap that a lot of 5 and 6 mana cards do, where if your opponent kills them right away, the tempo blowout is so severe that you often lose the game. The card was far closer to just being a 5 mana beater than people thought it would be, and these cards just aren't good enough in most standards. And at number 7, we have Nahiri's Wrath. This is a sorcery with the mana cost of 2 and 1 red. It has the additional cost where you have to discard X cards. It has the effect where it deals damage equal to the combined mana value of all the cards you discarded to each of up to X target creatures or planeswalkers. A lot of people saw this card and thought it would be an incredibly powerful removal spell. It was basically a one-sided Wrath of God, as long as you're okay with discarding your hand. On top of that, the standard at the time had a lot of Madness cards, which was an ability where whenever you discard a card with Madness, you would discard it into exile, and then you could cast it for its Madness costs. By discarding cards like Bloodhall Priest and Alchemist Greeting, you can get a ton of card advantage off of this card. There was also the Delirium mechanic, which paid you off for having 4 or more different card types in your graveyard. The idea of clearing your opponent's board for so little mana, and being able to do things like discard Madness cards to set up your graveyard for later plays, made some people think this card would be very strong. However, the card was actually pretty terrible. The fact was, the card was basically always card disadvantage when you cast it. If you were trying to use it to proc Madness on your cards, you'd have to wait until later than turn 3, when you'd have more open mana. And if you're waiting that long, why bother playing this when you could play a more traditional board wipe like Languish or Crux of Fate that would far more consistently do Wrath's job. The idea of the card being a huge tempo blowout in the early game didn't work out either, as your opponent likely wouldn't have enough cards that you wanted to remove, especially not ones you can get rid of with more traditional removal. All in all, the card was far too clunky to ever do anything, and its price dropped like a rock right after the set's release. And at number 6, we have Confounding Conundrum. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It is the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. It also has the ability where, whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if another land enters the battlefield under their control this turn, they return one of their lands to their hand. This card seemed insane when it was first revealed, to both the more competitive and casual player base. In more casual circles, ramp-based green decks are famously some of the most difficult to stop decks in casual Commander games. Lots of casual players consider green the best color in Commander because the amount of mana land-based ramp can allow you to really pull ahead in the game, giving you so much mana to cast draw spells and threats in the late game that it's basically impossible for your opponent to catch up. When Commander players saw this, they were expecting to be able to blow out all of these land-based ramp decks with this card. And while the card is still good in that case, the card hasn't been as much of an all-star as some players expected. The main issue was that it was just too bad against too many decks, and green decks could play around it too easily. This wasn't helped by the fact that green has access to enchantment removal to deal with the card. On the more competitive side, the card looked to be incredibly strong against fetch lands. These are lands that allow you to pay 1 life, tap and sacrifice them to find a land of 1 of 2 basic land types and put it onto the battlefield. These are incredibly strong, but they played poorly into Conundrum. If you played a fetch land and cracked on the same turn, you would trigger Conundrum and bounce one of your lands. Considering how widespread these cards were, making people play a land behind each time they played a fetch seemed extremely strong. The issue was that it was just a bit too slow. It didn't go up until turn 2, and you didn't really develop the board the turn you played it. This loss in tempo ended up being around as much as a loss in tempo from not being able to crack your fetches right away. On top of this, they could just wait until your turn to crack them, giving them the mana they wanted, so it only slowed down their sorcery speed plays. All in all, this card didn't do anywhere near as much as people thought it would. And at number 5, we have Dreadhorde Invasion. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. It has the abilities where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and amass 1. Amassing, for anyone who doesn't know, means that if you control an army creature, you put that many +1/+1 counters on it, but if you don't, then you create a 0/0 black zombie army creature token and put that many counters on it instead. It also has the ability where whenever a zombie token with 6 or more power you control attacks, it gains a lifelink until the end of the turn, meaning it dealing damage causes you to gain that much life. This card looked a lot like Bitter Blossom to a lot of people. The enchantment was considered an incredibly strong card back in its standard format. It was banned in Modern in 2014. Making a 1/1 token every turn for just 2 mana is a great rate. And while Amass doesn't quite work that way, it's very similar and it has the additional upside of letting you get your life back. Combining this with another Amass support like Widespread Brutality, a 4-mana sorcery that allowed you to amass 2 and then had your army token deal damage equal to its power to each creature, or enter the God Eternals. A 5-mana sorcery that dealt 4 damage to target creature, gained you 4 life, makes target player mills 4 and amasses 4. This all led people to believe that Amass decks would be real in Standard, and Invasion at the helm of the ship. However, this deck and this card was a lot worse than it looked. The issue was that the deck was too slow. It was too easy to blow up the deck by simply killing their army and making them start all over. It seemed like it wouldn't matter that much as they would usually make your opponent lose card advantage, but decks in the format had enough ways to generate card advantage or simply go over the top and end the game too quickly that Dreadhorde Invasion was fairly weak. Bitter Blossom making separate tokens made it a lot stronger, as it made it so that a single kill spell wouldn't set them back several turns worth of work. And at number 4, we have Chandra, Fire of Kaladesh. This is a 2/2 legendary creature human shaman with a mana cost of 1 and 2 red. It is the ability where, whenever you cast a red spell, you untap Chandra, and you can tap her to have Chandra deal 1 damage to target player or planeswalker. Then, if Chandra dealt 3 or more damage this turn, you exile her and transform into a planeswalker, Chandra Roaring Flame, and then return her to the battlefield. This is a 4 loyalty planeswalker with the abilities where you can +1 her to have her deal 2 damage to target player or planeswalker. You can -2 her to have her deal 2 damage to target creature, or you can -7 her to deal 6 damage to each opponent and give them an emblem with the ability. At the beginning of your upkeep, this emblem deals 3 damage to you. This card was a member of the cycle of 5 other legendary creatures that transformed into planeswalkers, called the Flipwalkers by the community. On reveal, Chandra was estimated to be one of the better members of the cycle. Her ability to deal direct damage to your opponent on her front half seemed really good, and flipping her to the back half seemed extremely easy. You could easily attack and cast a spell, untap and activate Chandra. This would mean that she had dealt 3 damage this turn, flipping Chandra and getting the planeswalker quickly. The back half seemed great too, being able to keep burning your opponent or removing blockers. She seemed like a great card for red aggro decks all around. However, the card ended up flopping hard, and she ended up being one of the worst members of the cycle. Every part of this card was clunkier than it looked. It was difficult to have enough cards in hand to transform Chandra, it was hard to stop her from simply dying to removal, and the back half didn't put enough pressure out to be worth it. Attacking with her basically never worked out. You see, a 3-mana 2/2 is a bad stat line. On your opponent's turn 3, they would basically always either play a kill spell for Chandra or a creature, and that creature would almost always be better than Chandra. You could use a removal spell to get rid of their blocker, but then you would have used your mana, and getting to attack with Chandra and then play another spell to flip her was even less likely. Seeing where the standard format actually went, all the hype for Chandra early on seems pretty silly. And at number 3, we have Aurelia's Fury. This is an instant with a mana cost of X, 1 red and 1 white. It has the effect where it deals X damage divided as you choose amongst any number of targets. You tap each creature dealt damage this way, and each player dealt damage this way can't cast non-creature spells this turn. This card looks incredibly versatile and useful in a ton of situations. It can stop your opponent from being able to cast a board wipe on their turn to deal with your board. It can tap down all the creatures or even kill them or all their creatures if you had enough mana. People were extremely hyped for this card, but it ended up not doing anything. The issue is that it was never really worth casting for any amount of mana. A 3-mana silence on your opponent is too expensive. A 3-mana to tap a creature was also just terrible. You could just be casting a simple removal spell that did this card's job better. The burn damage was usually outclassed by other burn damage spells for the mana cost. You really had to be spending a lot of mana on this card for it to be worth it, and the decks that could make the mana were usually interested in other effects. The types of decks that were interested in this kind of thing were aggro or mid-range decks, both of which usually wanted to end the game before they could dump 7 or 8 mana into the card to make it strong. While the card objectively has a very powerful effect, it just didn't have a home that could actually take advantage of it. And at number 2, we have Temporal Mastery. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 5 and 2 blue. It is the effect where you take an extra turn after this one, and then you exile Mastery. It also has Miracle for 1 and 1 blue, meaning that if you draw it as the first card you draw on a turn, you can cast it for its miracle cost. People thought this card was insane when it first came out. You see, there's a card called Time Walk, a member of the famously broken Power 9 that had the same effect and mana cost as the miracle version of Mastery. Because of this, people expected the card to be insanely strong. 2 mana for an extra turn had already proven to be an insane rate, and any card that was able to give you that should be broken. However, for the second time on this list, an extra turn spell ended up not being anywhere near as good as people expected it to be. The issue with this card was that you didn't get to choose when to play it. Most effects in Magic are time sensitive, and extra turn spells are especially dependent on the context in which you cast them. We've already explained how you need other cards to make your extra turn spells better, and not being able to choose when to cast them means that you weren't able to get the maximum value off of them. In fact, you often don't even get much value out of them at all. You'll often have nothing on the board when you top deck your mastery, or not having any good attacks, or any number of situations where taking an extra turn spell basically didn't do anything. The restrictions on this card made it a lot less useful, though it's not like it never found any home. It was used in a modern deck called Walks, a deck based around top decking and playing as many extra turn spells as possible, where it slipped into the strategy perfectly. It also saw some play in blue-white miracle decks, which relied on Sensei's divining top to put certain cards on top of their deck, which allowed them to get around all of these downsides. While the card has still been somewhat successful, it was definitely overhyped on release, dropping in price incredibly quickly after release. And at number 1, we have Browbeat. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 1 red. It is the effect where any player may have Browbeat deal 5 damage to them. If they don't, then target player draws 3 cards. This card seems great at first glance. Both halves of the card are way above rate, and drawing 3 cards in red is a very rare effect. When this card was released, people assumed it would be very, very strong. And well, you know how the story goes by now. So why did this card end up underperforming? The issue is that giving your opponent control over what your cards do is incredibly bad. Whatever's effect was worse for you at any point was the one you were getting. Sure, both effects were fine, but your opponent could pretty easily figure out which one they could deal with better. Usually, they would just take the damage until they were too low on life to do so comfortably, then they would shift to giving you the cards. This made it so the card could never do something like burn your opponent for lethal. So, if you top decked in the late game when you were staring down lethal next turn, they would just let you draw 3 cards, and often you wouldn't have the mana to cast those cards. A more consistent card could have saved you in that circumstance, or maybe you would need to draw the cards to find it out, but your opponent could just take 5 and kill you with their board. This lack of control means the effect has to be really strong for it to be worth it. If it drew more cards and dealt a little more damage, it would probably be worth it, but cards have to be more than just above rate to be worth giving your opponent the choice over what they do. They have to be way, way above rate. This card not only didn't get properly evaluated, but it's kind of the poster child for the Magic community learning a lesson about how bad giving your opponent these kinds of choices are. Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other good cards I may have missed or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments below.